September 11th, 2001, I was a senior in high school. I was in my second period partner dance class learning a swing dance number when the first plane hit. The second plane hit just before we transitioned to third period, so I didn't even know anything was going on until that class changed. During that change, I always stopped by this favorite teacher's room to say hello, and when I went in this time, she was watching the TV and panicked, and I asked her what happened, and she explained it to me. And then I had to go on to my third period economics class where the teacher didn't turn on the news, and so it really wasn't until fourth period that I was able to watch the TV and watch the news and really understand what was happening. To be entirely honest, at that point, it wasn't that scary. It was something that was happening to a building I barely knew anything about in a state far away to people I had never met. It wasn't personal. In fifth and sixth period, we watched the news and we started hearing the really bad horror stories. The towers had long fallen, so we started seeing footage of people covered in debris, footage of people walking across the bridge out of Manhattan. We saw a lot of footage of people screaming as the towers fell, and over and over and over, we saw the footage of the second plane hitting the towers. That afternoon, marching band practice was canceled. I would later hear that the younger assistant band director, he had made everybody in all of his classes watch TV silently, and he told them all that this was history happening and they needed to pay attention. Walking home with my sister, I remember pointing up and noting how there were no planes in the sky. I mean, it's not like we lived on a major plane thoroughfare or anything, but looking up and realizing there were no planes, and if you saw a plane, it was bad news. It was a very scary and unusual experience. At home, I continued to watch the news. There were dozens and dozens of reports of, other planes that were coming for other cities, and nobody knew what was going on. I don't really remember what happened for most of the afternoon, but I remember that evening, my mom and my sister were gone somewhere, and so my dad and I were watching the news in the completely dark living room. We saw people making hundreds and thousands of wooden stretchers out of plywood and planks because they were so sure these were gonna be needed to carry victims out of the towers. Nobody knew at that point that there were no living victims. We saw the footage of the towers collapsing, of the people running for their lives from the debris, and I remember my dad pointing to all the papers that were flying around and him saying, "It's incredible, those papers, they used to be on someone's desk." And oddly enough, it was at that point that I realized what that powder that was covering everything and everyone was. It was the crushed concrete, and it was the crushed desks, and the crushed papers, and the crushed office chairs, and the crushed computers, and the crushed people. And although I don't know why, it was at that moment that it suddenly felt personal. After we watched Congress address the country and break into an impromptu rendition of God Bless America, I went to my room and I cried. It felt stupid to cry in front of my father, in front of my family. It felt stupid to cry in front of anyone. In some ways, it still feels stupid to cry in front of anyone because I didn't lose anyone on September 11th. So what right do I have to be angry or upset or hurt? I didn't know anyone in New York, much less in one of those towers. Not one single person I knew, even impersonally, lost their life that day. And so sometimes I feel like I don't deserve to be affected. But I am, and what it is that affected me, that got to me so much, was thinking about the people on the upper levels of the trade towers, or the people on the airplanes, the people who had longer than a moment to realize what was happening. I mean, who do you call? What is your last act? How do you look at your daughter sitting next to you on a plane and you know that you're both going to die and you have longer than a moment to realize this and yet not enough time to save yourself? What do you do when you have longer than a moment to decide if you would rather die by fire or by falling? On September 11th, I always think over and over and over, all of those people, and they were forced to live their last moments in fear and panic and horror. I still don't understand why those people had to die, much less why they had to die the way they did. And the answer, God has a plan, has never fully satisfied me. And yet the idea that they just died meaninglessly, I also can't be satisfied with that. Again though, why does it matter to me? I didn't know these people. I didn't really even know much about the towers until that day. And yet I think that maybe that is exactly why I am so affected. All these people who I didn't know, people who I will never get to know, people whose deaths affected my life tremendously, and I do not understand why. But I do know that I'm not alone. I think a lot of people feel the same way I do, like we weren't in New York on September 11th, and yet we are always in New York because of September 11th. Because we can't forget the things we saw on the news, or the anger that we felt, or the sadness that we felt, or the fear that something else was going to happen at any moment. I know there are a ridiculous amount of September 11th documentaries and books and films and articles out there, and I know a lot of people are tired of hearing the phrase, September 11th changed everything, but it did. I know a lot of you either weren't alive or weren't old enough to have really vivid memories of that day. And I don't think it's fair to somehow act like you're wrong for not being frustrated or angry. But I do think it's really important that you understand as best as you can. That you realize I am not that much older than you, and yet we grew up in entirely different worlds. When I was growing up, terror alert and Al-Qaeda were not words I heard every day. You know, there was no risk at the airport of them patting down my grandma to make sure she didn't have a bottle of water on her. And yet there was also not really a sense of patriotism and pride, not only in your country, but in your fellow man. Because September 11th really brought out the worst in some people, but it also brought out the best in a lot of people. And it will never stop. The impact September 11th had on the world will never ever stop. Even as we heal, even as we rebuild, even as we struggle to understand. And I don't know that we will ever understand. And so maybe right now healing and rebuilding has to be enough. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again on Tuesday.